Hello everyone, I'm Jim Tolles. Welcome and thank you for joining me tonight for today's online talk about how to correctly interpret energy. If you're new to me, or just stumbled across this live stream, my name is Jim Tolles. I'm a spiritual teacher. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com and I do these free live streams every 2 weeks, alternating between this 6 o'clock p.m. Pacific time and 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. In 2 weeks from now, I'll be talking about spiritual awakening and dealing with disorientation. But in general, just talking about disorientation that can come anytime we're shifting something on the spiritual path, letting go of an issue, and stepping into these new spaces inside. So that'll be coming up in 2 weeks from today at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. I invite you all to join me then if you can. And this and all live streams are automatically recorded. And so my YouTube channel is Jim Tolles. And you just go there and you'll be able to find this and many other live streams and some other shorter videos that I've recorded in the past. Also, if you're new, on the right-hand side of your screen, probably depends on your screen. I don't know where it would be on a phone, but there's a live chat pod that allows you to type in questions that you may have. Usually I free flow for about 30 or 40 minutes, just sharing intuitively what's coming up on a topic. And then I get to everybody's questions and also I answer those intuitively, so I may not necessarily answer it in the way you expect or answer it at all. Usually I answer basically everything that comes my way, but this is part of speaking our truth, that we speak when we have something to share, and if we don't, then we don't. And it's a little bit different, I think, than the way a lot of people are used to people speaking. We seem to think we need to be talking all the time and talk about everything. So this is another little nugget of wisdom I offer to you, that as you come into your own voice, and trusting your voice means speaking when you feel called to, and then speak. And if you don't feel called to, then you don't. Also, along with my blog and this YouTube channel, you can find me at Spiritual Awakening Process on Facebook. That's the name of the page. On Twitter, on Pinterest, making the rounds in social media. These talks are all free, but if you feel moved to donate to help support me, I'm fully funded by donations and by some of you. And you can donate at my blog, spiritualawakeningprocess.com. On the right-hand side, there's a donation button with some options. And even if it's just $10, it matters, and thank you. And thanks already to all of you who already donate regularly. So I think this is enough preface. We can get into this topic of how to correctly interpret energy. And if somebody could just also say that you can hear me, that would be fantastic. As a quick sound check before I start talking. I assume, since nobody said I can't hear you, that you can, but it's always good to check. And once somebody does that, I'll get going. It's a fun topic. Thank you, Barbie. So, energy. I was thinking the other day, what is energy? And I figured that would be a great place to start. It's like, what are we even talking about, this energy thing? What are we feeling? When I talk about energy, I think I'm talking about something that we've all heard talked about in our pop culture and other different ways in spirituality. And we kind of all have kind of semi-definitions of it. And it's something that's worth your own while to look at your definition of what you mean by energy. But I think I simply mean that intelligent field of connection that's within us and around us and connects us to each other, that makes us all one. Many of you have heard my ocean metaphors. And so we can think of it like that we're all these droplets of water, but we don't have the borders we think we have. And so there are different currents in the ocean that move through us. Some impact us more than others. And we're part of some currents that move. So this deep, profound interconnection, that to me, I think is energy, this field we're all immersed in. But even being so deeply interconnected, we find ways to be so caught up in our beliefs and our ideas about ourselves and about others that we don't really even understand it. In many regards, it's no different than how a lot of us don't really understand our bodies. We don't really know how the heart works or how the muscles work or what the brain's doing. It just kind of works and we kind of go with it until something breaks, and then we end up, that's usually when we learn a lot about something. Is you don't really care about what's going on in your gut until the day you're having bloating or IBS or something, and then suddenly you really care and you really want to know how that works. And so there tends to be a lot of presumption with our bodies, and there's nothing ethereal about our bodies, right? We're living in them. We know what they are, sort of. Energy, however, of course, is not something we so easily point to. So we can be very vague in how we talk about it and how we understand it. It can get into sort of basic feelings. Well, this feels good to me or this feels bad, and that's really, really problematic for a lot of reasons, mostly because good and bad are already kind of being predefined in our unconscious, with these basic assumptions that we may or may not fully understand, but what we're interpreting something to feel good or feel bad. So while we're immersed in this field, we don't really look at it with awareness. Those of you who are really sensitive, you may feel a lot already. You already sense a lot, and some people can be extremely psychic and getting senses of energy in terms of like pictures and ideas that just kind of pop up into their minds. But even there, as clear as something may be on that level, we have to be even more cautious and more introverted in the sense of looking at what assumptions are potentially going on that are interpreting this energy into a visual image. Because a big aspect of interpreting energy is that interpretation, is what are the layers this thing is filtering through to come out with this output, to come out with this feeling, this idea about it, these images that we see about it. And almost nobody, as far as I know, really looks at that process, and that's kind of what I'm going to be talking a lot to you guys about today. It's like, what is this process of interpretation that's going on so quickly, so accurately or so inaccurately? We have to also be able to tell like when we're having an inaccurate interpretation. I think at the outset, we just assume that whatever is coming into our head and how we're responding is correct. And what I'm saying is initially, it probably isn't. Every now and then you have some kids who had some good parents who understood this stuff, and so they kind of stayed more open, and so they kind of have less stuff in the way. But even then, this is like any tool set. It's how we refine it, and refining helps us to focus into deeper levels. And so I was definitely very fortunate that, in my family, they let us have our intuitions. They didn't say, well, just to ignore what we sensed and felt. And so there was some encouragement. So that was really helpful. But that didn't mean I came out of my childhood with a very accurate ability to interpret energy. Over the years, doing the spiritual teaching and sitting with so many different people and energies and talking to them and having that feedback and different levels of confirmation, that has helped me in refining my ability to really sense people. And it's kind of like a microscope where you just get better and better at going into finer and finer details. It's like kind of recreating the lenses as you're using the thing. So you go deeper and deeper and you can get more and more precise and accurate. But that's not usually where most of us start. And I'm not sure how many people are really working with that refining. And there are some interesting ways where we refine that I think we'll also talk about a little bit tonight. And the big piece of the refining is around letting go of the ego, that extra filter that stands in the way of this energy, and correctly understanding what we're sensing. I would also say, as we're setting up into this discussion, that intuition and energies, it's not just a feeling. The feeling is almost always, in my opinion, a response that comes from our body interpreting this energy in a certain way. It just can come very, very quickly. And as I said before, it often has to do with how we're predisposed towards some of the information. So think of intuition as simply a mesh or energy. I mean, to me, it all starts to kind of be intertwined. So think of it, this energy is a kind of message. And whether you like the message that's coming or not, that's the feeling that people have. So they'll say, oh, I'm having a bad feeling about this, or I'm having a good feeling about it. Well, no, that's not what the message is. The message is not the feeling. Your response to that message, that's the feeling that you're having. And that actually can get in the way in a lot of regards. And a lot of our assumptions about what we should feel good about or feel bad about can be deeply, deeply wrong. Because some things that to us look like are going to bring difficulty, let's say like, going through a divorce, may actually not be difficult once you do it. And I've supported people through divorces, and some of them had very easy ones. And so, where if somebody had an intuition out, that's something they needed to do, and they would have a bad feeling about it, potentially, once you go through it, you realize that bad feeling was a response to the message. The message being that I need to separate from this person. The bad feeling being all the assumptions that this is a bad thing, you're not going to do well with it, or the other person's going to be mean to you, or whatever. And then you step through and you're like, oh, this wasn't a bad thing at all. It's actually a good thing. So this is why cleaning out the ego filters so that we can hear these things clearly is so important. Because some people, that bad feeling will be so strong that they won't do it. They'll stay and they'll ignore the energy that's kind of drawing them away into a different part of life, away from this other person. They'll ignore their intuitive responses that are feeling through this energy and are saying, yeah, we got to go. Why are we still here? And that creates more and more inner conflict. A big aspect of energy is flow, and it's an intelligent flow. So we really also have to separate a sense of just being kind of lazy and letting life move us any which way we want, which some people think is going with the flow, and it's not, from this very intelligent sort of guidance that runs through us and is surrounding us and is surrounding this whole globe and the whole universe. But this really takes us back into this inner looking of how am I experiencing myself? What are my assumptions and my beliefs? What pain am I holding on to? Pain is one of those things that we like to avoid. And it's one of the first issues and big issues that we face when we seriously take on the spiritual path and we continue to face this aversion to pain. To me, it's one of 3 fundamental aspects of being a human being. We're trying to survive, so we don't want to die. We don't like pain, which definitely links closely to the death thing, but to me it's not exactly the same. And then there's the sex drive, the drive to procreate and keep the species going. And those are our basic animal impulses, and we're not beyond them. In fact, most of the ego is really still serving them. So becoming a more conscious person means we're taking ownership of these old instinctual impulses, and one of which is this aversion to pain. Because there are many ways where things that are difficult are, one, being caused by our ego. The very thing that's trying to avoid pain ends up making things more painful. It's like being scared about the separation and divorce I was talking about before. That's the ego making more pain that doesn't have to exist. And then because you don't like the pain that it's making inside you, then there's another part that says, well, I better not do that, which creates more pain because now you're separating from your own knowing and the flow and where it wants to go. And you can also think of this sort of ego response as like putting a dam in the river. And that creates a lot of that inner pressure that makes things even more painful. So in an attempt to avoid pain, we usually end up heaping it onto ourselves. So this flow can be very persistent. But we really do have to turn our attention inwards to start to understand ourselves, to understand some of the things like momentum that we create in life. And this is another term, I haven't used it for a while. But when we've been putting so much energy into certain ways of living and acting, it kind of creates a feedback loop of momentum. It's like you just keep moving in a certain direction. That doesn't necessarily mean you're flowing in something that's in truth to you. That just means you've put enough energy into it that other people are feeding that energy back to you and are supporting you and going that direction. You know, it's like you have a good career going, but it's not necessarily true to you. But people keep offering you jobs even after you quit the first one. And so if you're not aware of yourself and what's true to yourself, sometimes people jump to this conclusion of like, oh, well, this must mean I should stay in this career field, right? Because it keeps coming back to me. And this is one of the many confusions people have. And I would simply say that no, this isn't necessarily anything to do with flowing. This has to do with how much energy you've expended in this direction and how people know who you are currently. They may not actually know who you really are. And knowing who you really are is really the first step in all of this here. Because if you don't know yourself and how you respond to things, you're not going to know how to interpret energy, or much less anything else. Like, people are bad enough at interpreting other people whom you are having actual conversations and interactions with. And then, you know, somebody will say something and you're like, oh, I guess this person hates me now, right? That's a misinterpretation of somebody else's response to you. And, you know, that other person's response probably has nothing to do with you. Right? So I'm just continuing to set up why we have to look at that ego self and our issues, because in things that we should have a pretty good handle on, we don't, much less getting into the subtle energetic field, how it flows through us, how it interconnects us, and the things we feel from other people, which I know is going to be a big topic that a lot of you have questions on. So I'm just building up into this conversation to show you, like, this is why we have to do our inner work. And I'm just going to keep saying that over and over, because otherwise it is so easy to misinterpret energy. Because it's already so easy to misinterpret everything else. So the big ego issues that we face again and again are around fear. And it's usually around fear of being hurt, some way or another. So you start to work on those layers of yourself. Say, okay, here's this fear, here's this other fear. You just start invite them all home to tea. It's like, all right, everybody sit down. You're not going anywhere, so there's no point in trying to keep you out of the proverbial inner house. So come on down, sit down, tell me what you're scared about. And we start to make this space for ourselves to sit with ourselves and say, okay, I'll listen to it. Just keep telling me. And as many of you know, and I talk so much about doing inner work, over time, that stuff breaks down as you lose interest in it, as you stop believing it, as you resolve some of the deeper core issues that are there. And then a beautiful thing can happen as we start to move into these new spaces, these spaces where we don't necessarily know how we feel or how to act or how to think. One of my blog posts in March was around the fear of the unknown, and this is a really, really important point. That often when you're succeeding, really, you have to learn how to sit in the space of the unknown. Just sit here and breathe. And then you face that next fear, right? The fear that's saying, oh, I need to know something. I need definition. And, you know, at times we need definition, like knowing that you need to get more food at the grocery store. But we don't necessarily need as much as we think. And usually what happens is the fog of that time, that shift, settles. And you get clearer. And this is when it starts to get easier to interpret your own energy and how you're moving and where the next step is. And it's really coming back to the present moment, being in your presence, being in your own space of inner love and clarity as you drop away more and more issues. And then the next step just kind of becomes obvious. And in this way, we start to find that flow inside us. We start to feel it. And this starting to feel this authentic flow is so important because it starts to give you a benchmark, some sort of reference point. And well, I often talk about how we lose reference points with the ego. The unconscious ego, all those old reference points are wrong. Right? They're telling us like this is what success looks like. And that's usually just a bunch of social beliefs that we've been taught to believe are important. So this is a different kind of reference point where you start to have a sense like this is how energy moves. This is what feels natural and true to me. And sometimes that will still cause a fear reaction. But there's a difference once you started to work through your fears. You start to say, oh, okay, right? So I move through this fear. It's still screaming in the background that, you know, the sky is falling, but I do it anyway. Right, so there's a certain development of courage at this point in learning to understand and feel your own energy. And we have to start here first, because the better you can feel this, the easier it's going to be to interpret energetic interactions with others, with different places and regions around the world. And there's all kinds of energy going on in every different direction you can imagine. And part of what the ego really does is it shuts out a lot of that, because it's just like playing every radio station in the world on the same exact frequency all the time. And so like our egos try to like separate it all out. So some of you who are really sensitive, when you drop a layer, right, you lose kind of one of those walls, one of those things that's keeping out some of the information. And so then you'll get more information suddenly, and it's like you've got 5 radio stations playing in your head, and you just kind of feel overwhelmed. Well, sit, breathe, give yourself time to adjust. You will adjust. You'll be okay. And usually what I find is then after a while I get, in my own personal experience, I get used to hearing the 5 stations, and I can start to tune in or tune out of them. And that's a very powerful thing. So where the unconscious ego has already tuned you out of a lot of different things. And for those who are sensitive, it's also letting in other things. So you've got a strange mix of some energies that you don't really need to know anything about, and other stuff that probably would be useful to feel and to inform you on, and you can't hear that. So as you let go, and as you practice with this, and practice is key to good interpretation, you can figure out when you want to tune into someone. So, I can look at the list, and just as a quick aside, I see your questions and I will get to them. I'm just kind of free flowing. But if I really wanted to, I could tune into Sharon right now and feel a lot, because I've been practicing with it, and it's not that hard for me to do. But also as part of this, I don't care to do that very often unless I'm sitting in a session, because I don't necessarily need that energetic connection or ongoing information. So I think there's something to be said around appreciating other people's privacy to a certain degree. It's like how much you want to tune into other people. It's a little invasive. For some of us, as we're really open, I already get enough information energetically just being me. But there's depths that you can go to. So that's just kind of another quick aside, because I think every now and then there's somebody who's really psychic who's getting off and knowing what other people have going on inside them. And that's not what this is for. Although ultimately, the further we go on the spiritual path, the more we find out that there are no secrets, because we all are all interconnected. Now there are four levels that I often talk about with energy. The first being the energy itself, as it comes through this funnel into interpretation. And I want you to think of words as being a very, very small embodiment of something that's much bigger. So at the top of the funnel, it's energy is like this, right? It's just so vast, and there's so much energetic information in it. And then it starts to come down into human thought, right? And human thought to me is smaller than this thing up here. And so that can take a while to process. And sometimes some of you may notice that as you're relaxing and shifting, that there's this kind of mental processing going on that you can't explain. Well, in my opinion, sometimes that's energetic, that you're starting to learn how to process different energies. Some people, will talk about getting downloads from God, and you can think of it that way. Right? This is starting to come down the funnel into something that's thinkable. And then I don't know if language and thought are immediately tied together. I separate them out. But then I feel like it drops into language. Right? So English isn't the only language that energy translates into. It's going to translate into whatever your main language is, wherever you are. And then finally at the bottom, we can actually talk about it. And these are all very different steps. A lot can go wrong at any stage of the way. And usually, some of the biggest problems are about the time we start to put language around it. So this is where, I think having somebody else who's sensitive or at least open can be nice as a friendship, to just kind of talk through different feelings you may have. And I think one of the ways that's best to practice is to not tell someone what you're feeling about them if you're engaging in this particular connection. Let them know that this is what it's about, right? So it's not a surprise. It's not, reading somebody without permission. But let them say how they feel. and then you can just kind of gently question about different things that relate to what you're feeling. And the reason why I say it like this rather than saying, this is how I feel you, is because it can give you a better sense of confirmation, and the other person doesn't necessarily kind of try and please you and say, oh yeah, I'm feeling that too, because people are very suggestible. So if I said to somebody, that I'm feeling a lot of warmth around their heart and their chest, this area, sometimes people will make that up. So that's why, what I'm saying is like, you just sort of ask like, hey, what are you feeling? What are you sensing? How do you feel today? And they sort of say, oh, I'm feeling this or feeling that. Or they might say, I'm feeling a lot of love. And then you ask, like, where are you feeling a lot of love? And say, oh, around my chest. And so that gives you confirmation that energetically what you're feeling is actually accurate. And you're not just making this up, and you're not suggesting it to someone who's then, saying it back to you. So I think this is helpful on that, bringing something down into language, into words. I mean, just bringing language to words sometimes is problematic for people, right? When we know what we want to say and then we say it wrong. So once again, this is why practice is important, and why we want to really work with kind of cleaning out this energetic filter and the ego filter so that it can come through as cleanly and clearly as possible. With this also comes a lot of humility, because like I said, if energy starts up here, by the time it gets down to here, it's really small. So you've just left out like a ton. And to me, that's not good or bad. That's just we're human beings. And that's, to me, kind of the nature of being in a dense body, trying to explain something that's energetic and is very light and undense. There's only so much thing can get through. So you're kind of humble about these things, where you don't necessarily assume that everything you feel like on that level and sense is absolute truth. You kind of get a better sense that you're picking up a piece of the puzzle. Whenever you're picking up new information, and this once again happens as you let go of issues, you start to be able to connect to people and feel them in ways that you couldn't feel before, and other people that before you would just not have even seen, right? Now you're connecting with them and talking to them, and you may be feeling very different energies from them. Don't interpret it quickly. Don't rush to conclusions. Spend your time getting to know this person, how they interact, and you will start to kind of get a sense of things, and you get a sense of what different energies mean through that repetition. Repetition is really, really helpful to correctly interpret energy. Usually, especially, if you're connecting with similar people over and over, their energetic fields don't change that much in my experience. At least not at the deeper levels. They kind of are a certain way unless somebody does a lot of inner work. And so if your interpretations of them are constantly changing, you may just be kind of focusing on kind of their emotional well-being rather than sort of the deeper essence of the person. That's not good or bad, but it's just something to be mindful of. And getting caught up in other people's emotions and how that generates its own little waves of energy is just an endlessly rocking sea. There's always something going on in people's emotions. Emotions are always in motion. So even as you're getting really good at this, and especially for those of you who get very strong psychic messages, be humble with it and don't immediately accept everything as absolute truth. Look into it, feel into it, and with any sort of true impressions, they tend to be consistent. So as you continue to let go of issues, do your best to let go of any sort of feeling associated with these messages that you feel, with the energy you feel. And I'm talking about that emotional quality of whether, it feels scary to you or it feels good to you. Because that's still kind of an ego response saying, I like what I'm sensing or I don't like. There are deeper levels of awareness within us where we can watch these kind of energetic flows move through us. Sometimes it can be very physical. Like sometimes if you're feeling really connected to another person, you can feel what's going on in their body and your body. And that's a powerful level of understanding and energetic information. So on that level, it can be very easy for some people who haven't been doing enough inner work to get upset, right? Because suddenly you're feeling like how clamped down somebody's heart is. And it just feels like this vice is suddenly on your chest when you're around this person. Some people assume this is a bad person. This person's doing something to them or putting a hex on them. I mean, I get some really, really poorly understood ideas sent my way. And so I'm just pointing you towards this sort of neutralizing of reaction. It's really important, especially, with powerful energies. And some people, when you're really a sensitive person, some people out there are going to be in a lot of pain, but if it's triggering something in you, that's still showing you where there's pain inside you. And I wouldn't say that it's super comfortable to be around somebody who's got their heart completely locked down into a vice. But you learn to be with it and to not take it personally. And interestingly enough, you feel it in your chest, and in the body, seems like the most personal thing we have. But even the body ultimately isn't personal. When we're in awareness, we're just kind of noticing the body itself. And this body is not us. It's just a tool. It's a vehicle to move through this life. And so the less we get upset about those sorts of things, the more we can be with somebody who probably needs a kind ear if their emotions and their heart is so shut down like that. Not to have somebody else just run away. So there's a slowness that's really helpful with correctly interpreting energy. And over time, you won't need the slowness as you get better and better at kind of sensing these things neutrally. And you sort of get a sense of how you're connecting with someone, when it's appropriate to share something that you feel intuitively and when it's not. And it just becomes more and more natural. So the resistance and the ego stuff in so many regards is just unnatural to how we flow. And we have to get back to the flowing part before we can start to refine it, to work with it and to help cultivate it. It's kind of like if you learn to run wrong and you're going to be a professional runner, right? You'll have a trainer has to break down your step again, your stride. And that's really weird to do for a while and uncomfortable. And so you have to learn how to just walk and then run. And then you can start to build up and go more quickly again. And I think the same sort of principle applies to interpreting energy, is that we initially are just really muddy and unclear. And that lack of clarity immediately clouds how we interpret any energetic situation. And let's also get into powerful energetic connections. Somebody you connect really, really powerfully with can be two streams of water blasting into each other, and that pushes up a lot of things that are stuck inside of you. And so you can have this powerful connection, you can have all this pain get revealed at the same time. So once again, there can be that tendency of that old ego self is saying, "Whoa, this is intense." So the ego may not like intensity because we're not used to it. We're usually too shut down to be able to handle much more than a stream of water lapping gently at our ankles. So getting a blast in the face from the fire hose of love is just too much for it. So there's that aspect, and then there's all the other stuff that somebody hasn't been dealing with. And the closer the energetic connection, the more deeply connected you are, the less can hide. You can see in my hands, think of it like this. This is a really deep energetic connection. These two hands hardly have any space between them. They're just clamped this close. So if there is any sort of issue between them, it's getting pressurized in a big way. And the tendency, as I keep saying, is usually the ego self wants to blame the other person. And say, "Oh, it's the other person's fault I'm feeling this pain. It's not mine. It's not my issue." But our capacity to be with other people's pain when it's actually just theirs and not our own is really, really big. Right? Obviously, it's part of the work I do, that being clear in myself, I can be around people with a lot of pain, and because I can be with them, I can help them. If I was too triggered in my own pain, I would be useless. Right? I would be too busy dealing with all the stuff coming up out of myself to do much of anything for someone else. So for those of you who are interested in healing or are going to or already doing healing, right, this is something to remember. That's why self-care is super important for any healer, any teacher, any psychiatrist. I mean, there's a lot of people in the mental health field that are dealing with a lot of upset energies, and they're sensitive themselves, and that can be a lot to bear if you haven't done enough of your own inner work. So I see there's some questions, and I think, that was a good time to pause. And if other people have questions to type down in the chat pod, and please keep it polite. I'll respond as I'm intuitively guided. And also just a reminder that I blog regularly over at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And if you want to help support me, everything I do is run by donations. And there's a donation button on the right-hand side. And thank you for any who choose to donate. And thanks for all who have made this work possible, because I am a full-time spiritual teacher thanks to donations. So earlier Will asked, is it common to feel like you're in the flow of things and see that it seems like other people are off and try to put judgment on you? I feel that we are all one at times, but I do feel separate from a lot. Well, people are going to judge regardless. So that can never really be part of your decision to trust your inner flow. If it is, that's kind of a reflection of other issues inside you, often self-worth issues, that you're looking for approval from others. You're looking for safety from others, right? Because if the herd likes us and accepts us, there's a deep mechanism inside us that says we're safe when we have a community around us liking whatever we do. So there's a lot there to kind of look at as far as any sort of judgment concerns you have. And as far as other people being off there, where they are on their path, and we have to learn to accept wherever anybody is. The few exceptions are usually around near and present dangers. Somebody's a danger to themselves or a danger to others. But that's not usually what we're dealing with. So I hope that helps. From Sharon, can you please talk about fear? Is that a feeling that is separate from intuition? I find myself at times trusting the fear, thinking that is my intuitive guidance. Well, it's never clear-cut for us at first. Later on, it becomes really, really clear-cut that fear and intuition are really different. It's just, everything is just so muddled up in the beginning of our work, Sharon, that we're like, well, what's what in this? Changing the hand metaphor, I guess I'm going to use my hands a lot tonight, right? Let's say this is fear and intuition intertwined right now, and it's tough to tell which is which. And so over time of doing our work, we kind of start to peel those apart. We start to look at the fear and what it's saying, what's the bad outcome, because that's what fear is saying. Fear is saying there's going to be a bad outcome. And then, over time, you start to get a stronger and stronger sense. And to me, my experience is intuition always comes first. If you search on my blog, I have a bunch of posts about intuition, and one of which is a compilation post under the starting out section that kind of talk more about it. But intuition to me comes first, and it's neutral. It doesn't care what you do. You can do what the intuition says or not. Fear cares what you do. So it has an agenda. And so when there's that agenda that's trying to draw you into its game, you always want to stop and go slower. That's usually going to be my advice for most of this stuff, is stop and go slower, because that itchiness and that drive of fear has to break down. If you start to act from it, then you're reinforcing all the parts of your body that are used to acting it out. And this is an important aspect of facing pain, which we're so often trying to avoid, and which ultimately clouds our ability to interpret energy. And intuition really is that interpretive mechanism, I guess I should say. So yeah, fear can be intertwined with intuition, but other times it's just fear. So that's a good thing to journal about and kind of dig into and say, okay, so what am I scared about here? Where is it coming from? Another thing that kind of, because of fear, that kind of creates what I call superstition. Like, to me, superstition is out of place with the current moment. So where intuition is very present moment, and it's usually if something you need to know right now. With superstition is like projecting onto a moment some other idea from the past, like the black cat crossing your path is bad luck or something like that. Right? So that's superstition. It has nothing to do with the current present moment. It has nothing to do with that poor cat that you're looking at. It has to do with like these old social beliefs and your own fear kind of coming together and creates this superstitious thing that you think this is a bad thing. Barbie says she needs to learn how to turn off incoming info. I think this is a matter of relaxation and non-reaction. So the more neutral you are to these things, Barbie, you feel all this stuff and then you relax and it's gone. The reason like this stuff gets overwhelming is usually because we're hooking into it. There's some part of us wanting to hear all this stuff and is paying too much attention. And so the practice of being in the space of the witness and meditation is hugely powerful, and coming back to ourselves and just feeling ourselves, checking in with our own energy. And as I was saying earlier, like, we have to know our own energy, what that feels like, because then we start to get a better sense of when someone's connecting to us and how we're connecting to them, versus before everything's just kind of muddled. So from Manny, so would you say that sensitive people need to put more inner work as opposed to those who aren't? Honestly, yes. And I've said this in a lot of other videos and things before. I absolutely think they do. That, you know, if you've already got this incoming information on the radio, you've got the 10 radio stations, and everybody else, you know, in life has only got one. That's what you got to work with. But in time, you know, it's a hugely amazing gift, because I can have a sense of who I want to connect with in life and what feels true. And it is so correct so often. As a spiritual teacher, I use it every day. And anytime I start to deny like the energetic information I'm getting, I end up, you know, not having as, I don't want to say a positive outcome, but it just doesn't flow. It doesn't seem to work as well. And when I do listen to it and I'm connecting, you know, to others, you know, that have that energetic flow, and I've listened, it works so amazingly well, and it's alive, and it keeps building on itself and doing wonderful things. So that's the other side of being able to interpret energy, is it's really, really useful. Because there's so much stuff going on in the world that we can't ever possibly know rationally. You just can't have enough information. So this is another level of information that's really, really useful. So the next question, and I hope this has answered other people's questions, let me know. And thanks everybody, there's just so much, it's great. Dan saying, hey Jim, when things are triggered in you, what do you recommend doing if you are in a situation where you cannot let it flow through you per se? For example, if you're teaching a class, release it later on the day. No, release it then. It's just, how you release to me is just simply a matter of breathing and watching. You know, most other people don't have to know that you're breathing and watching if, you know, you're in the middle of teaching a class. You just pause, you know, take a few breaths as you're just kind of feeling through what's coming up, and that will usually ground it pretty quickly. There's a real problem if we start to hold on to anything, because if we hold on to it once, it tends to want to keep staying, and we're building this mechanism of resistance. Releasing an issue to me is not necessarily like, you know, a big cry fest. It can be, but with those initial triggers, you know, as far as like the deeper issue, you just kind of note it in your head. Like, oh, well, here's something for later. As far as that, doing that later, yeah. You know, digging into it with your teacher or journaling or whatever you care to use. But as far as like the initial emotional response, you just breathe through that one and then it moves on. From Becky says, when I feel emotions from others, is what I'm feeling always an indicator as to where my inner work needs to be looked at? No, I mean, you can definitely be clear enough to like have a sense, wow, I'm feeling like this wave of sadness, right? It just washes through you. It's really more of your reaction. If you get upset, if you get sad, Becky, then you're like, oh my God, I'm going to cry, you know, or something like that. Yeah, that's you having work that you need to do. But just the fact that you feel it, that's just, you know, like I was saying to Manny, helpful information. Say, wow, this person's really sad. And maybe they have room for you to interact with you about that, and you can support them or help them if you feel called to. Or maybe that's just information. Say, you know what, I don't have the space to support somebody who's feeling this sad today, so I'll gently excuse myself. Right? So it's these types of things you start to kind of understand about yourself. But, you know, it's the reaction inside, right? That knowing yourself when you're having a reaction versus when you're just kind of generally feeling something going on with somebody else. So I hope that's helpful. From Regina, with regards to interpreting energy, how about the energy coming from our subpersonalities, like the inner child, the ego, the victim and protector, etc.? I haven't separated it like that, because to me, like, you know, they're all just kind of inner issues. I mean, I suppose you can separate it that way. And I would expect after a while you'd be pretty good at it. So there's, you know, that's perfectly fine as you kind of get a sense of it. But over time, what happens is all that stuff kind of melts away. So there's just kind of you. Yeah, I guess that's what I have to say about that. I hope that's helpful. From Barbie, can you recommend any further reading on the topic of healing others and psychic ability? I find when I'm extreme in connection with someone's energy, I take that as an indication I'm supposed to help. Well, I don't know that I have any extra reading on that, but I would say that, the presumption that you're supposed to help is a big jump in logic. So this kind of comes back to the neutralization part that I've been talking about. It's like, just notice that there's a connection. And there are many kinds of connections. So that's another aspect of interpreting energy. I've been using the ice cream shop metaphor again in some of my sessions, and I'll use it here. And think about energy as like these hundreds of thousands of different flavors of ice cream. Oftentimes our ego gets very narrow. So on the energetic connection level, people get into this, I'm looking for a romantic connection. Maybe somebody knows to look for a teacher connection or a friend connection, right? And so that's like three flavors of ice cream out of hundreds of thousands. So this is another reason why we want to go slow and give ourselves time to open up to different levels of connection and to communicate. Right? So if too much of this stuff stays in our head, we're not getting useful feedback. And sure, some people aren't going to be completely honest about what's going on with them. That's fine. That's why I mentioned find a friend or two where you can kind of talk about these things, because it helps you to refine that interpretation ability. And it's like I was saying before, where like this has to be the understanding that this is what you're going to share about. And you let the other person share with you how they're feeling and where they're feeling. And you can just ask questions about different things, like I was saying with the parts of the body. So if you're feeling something strong in their gut, you can just kind of ask them about different areas of the body. And that kind of gives you this gentle way of, one, helping them pay attention to themselves. Because a lot of us aren't paying attention to ourselves, right? And we don't necessarily know what energy we're spinning off at other people. And then, it gives a way to bring yourself confirmation. And sometimes you'll find out you're wrong. And that's really important. Because a lot of these bad assumptions that go on that lead people to make really bad judgments and take bad actions, right, that can hurt themselves or hurt other people, come from, not being accurate. Right? And all the ways the ego gets involved or just decides that it's right about something. So that interplay, I think, is one of the themes of tonight that I'm talking about, and I really can only encourage you towards. Because there are other people who are energetically sensitive. I mean, we got like 28 people watching right now that are interested in this topic, and I can tell you there's a lot more than just 28 around the world. So that sort of practice, I think, is really, really helpful. And then you start to notice, powerful, there are teacher-student connections, and there's like, patron connections, people who are there just monetarily to support you, and there's volunteer connections and colleague connections, and just things that naturally flow. And you just start to get a sense of those things, and you trust them and you engage with them. But especially as you're opening up, you're going to feel things that you haven't interpreted before. You don't really know what they are. And anytime that happens, don't make any conclusion. But through repetition of being around that person, if you want to be around this person, you'll get better and better kind of interpreting what that energy means and going through those 4 steps of energy, thought, language, words. I hope that's helpful. From Damien, can you talk about intercepting others' negative energy and how to react with positive energy without letting it affect our emotions? So firstly, I take out the negative positive thing. Because to me, this is part of the very thing that I'm talking about, this bad feeling, good feeling thing. Because that to me is the same thing. Negative energy, we usually mean this is a bad feeling. Positive energy, this is a good feeling. And that's ego judgment. The ego has to sit there and judge all these kind of amorphous energies that are moving through life and decide this falls into this bucket and that falls into that bucket. So we're letting go of those buckets. And also it doesn't help you. Because it doesn't really tell you, like, what is negative. Is this your response that's going on inside you? Are you feeling just a wave of fear? If it's just a wave of fear, that's fine. People feel fear all the time. Right? It's nothing to be upset about, or if it's sadness, or if it's shame. The biggest thing always is, are you feeling triggered by it? Because if you're feeling triggered by it, and now you want to change somebody else, and if it's affecting your emotions, that means you're triggered. So that's on you. So going inside to start to find out, well, what's upset inside? What's responding to this particular energy that's coming out of someone? And then you breathe and relax. And that's part of step 1 of neutralizing. And then you can focus on parts of your body where you're feeling the strongest. Oh, it's in my heart. So now we know we're dealing with some sort of heart issue or something locked in the chest. And so you can kind of use that experience now to help you go deeper in your work. Where before, if we go the other way and we just start to think about how to control our emotions and how to respond back, we're not being mindful. We don't understand what's actually happening inside. And we've missed an opportunity to go deeper in our work and to be clearer. So hopefully that's helpful. The next question is, can you differentiate frequency and vibration? Honestly, I don't think I can. I'm not sure what that means. Generally speaking, I don't get into high-low frequencies and vibrations. I think that's very problematic for the most part, because a lot of people end up using that as a mask for saying I'm better than somebody else, unfortunately. Right? This is happening right now in a lot of the spiritual world. People are also using unconscious and conscious, and unconscious is being used in a pejorative term, saying, this person's bad and I'm better than them. So any sort of those types of definitions I stay away from. I just keep the focus on ourselves and residing more and more deeply in peace. And whatever vibration or frequency somebody wants to call that, I don't care, honestly, because usually when you're at peace, you don't care. You're at peace. So if there's something specific there that's part of the question, please let me know. Know yourself is just so central to everything I teach and talk about, and it's so central to interpreting energy. That the more you know yourself, the easier it is to interpret a lot of different things and to know when you're being triggered and when something's coming up and be like, oh, this is my work, and being responsible for it. So part of this conversation is inherent responsibility for ourselves. Because when we know ourselves, then we don't blame other people for how we feel, because no one makes us feel things. Right? We choose our feelings. Even if it's deeply, deeply unconscious, we're choosing them. And certainly there are levels of connection and feelings that you start to have more and more as you open up. But as I kind of mentioned to Becky earlier, that as you open up and you're clearing yourself, they're just waves washing through, and it's nothing that takes you out of your peace. It doesn't take you away from who you are. It doesn't inhibit your emotions. Thanks everyone for all these great questions. If other people who haven't asked any questions want to, we've got 9 minutes, so feel free, you're more than welcome. But, just kind of going back to something I was mentioning, based off of Manny's question, this is also an amazing gift, that to feel these things moving through our life, and it starts to guide us towards connections that we didn't even realize existed, is such a beautiful thing. It's just truly extraordinary, and it really opens us up to life. Right? This energetic field that we're all part of is alive. It's moving and flowing through us, and so much of what our ego does is it tries to hold on to like this one little node in the whole energetic field and just hold on for dear life until we die. And it's like, that's not a way to live. And when somebody's highly sensitive, they can definitely get caught into that sort of grip, because on top of all the other normal physical and emotional things going on, they're getting all this other energetic stuff going through them, and they don't necessarily know what to do with it. But it's nothing to be afraid of. So you just keep coming back to yourself. Sitting in your own space and learning about yourself. And as you do that, it just keeps clearing out that ego filter, so that what does come through can be as pure as it can be for a human being. And that definitely has its limits. And as you do that, your interpretive awareness grows. Some people can see more into the future, but it's really not about that. Being present in the fullness of this present moment is such a rich place that most of us don't really feel a need to reach beyond it. I have another question. What do you have to say about past life, trauma, karma clearing? I think that's like 3 questions. So we'll start with 1. Past life, yes, there are past lives. I often call them concurrent lives, because ultimately time is a fiction. And if you want to think of time, think of it like looking on a map and looking down, and there are all these roads, but they only go in one direction, and that's time. And so when we start to step out of time, like, we can kind of move anywhere on that map. So that's one thing. I only ever deal with those concurrent lives when it's needed. And so those just kind of happen in a session. And then you go into them in certain ways, and then you let those go. Usually you don't have to go looking for them, because most of them aren't invasive, because to me, ultimately, like, you're interconnected to all of them all the time. And that's kind of, part of like that soul bubble, I guess, but which is ultimately interconnected to everyone else all the time. And so everything just blends together into oneness. So I try not to get into creating new levels of separation into the energetic fields beyond what's necessary. Trauma, and I can see why you asked about it. If trauma is linked to past life, yeah, that definitely can carry over for some people, interestingly enough. I've dealt with it in a couple of cases with people. But trauma also should get its own part of the question, and healing trauma is just a big, big deal, because when somebody is badly emotionally and physically wounded, that just ends up really, really defining how somebody's ego is. And it's usually all based around, how do I get safe? And that automatically skews how you're going to interpret everything, not just energy. And karma, I think that just depends how we define it. Usually karma, I'm just kind of defining as issues in general. I know that has more specific definitions for some people. By and large, I stick with this lifetime, because most people have tons of stuff in this lifetime. And never forget that from 0 to 5 years old, most of us have no memory at all. And I think that can be confused as past life things or stuff from, karma carrying from other lifetimes and things like that, because we forget it, because we have no memory of it. And so anything that was upsetting, it doesn't have to be traumatic, but just generally upsetting from 0 to 5 years that you can't remember is going to be remembered in your physical body, energetic body, and your emotional body, even though your intellectual part can't remember it. And so those are some of the deeper healings, and there's plenty of that usually to work in most people, as well as anything they remember later on to work on. So all those things absolutely influence who we think we are, the egos we create, and how that creates a lens over our ability to interpret energy. So I hope that's helpful. From Will, and maybe one or two more questions. Once again, if you haven't asked, now's the time before we close. And Will is asking, when you find yourself holding on or a repetitive thought that has weight that you have bought into in the past and is so convincing, how would you recommend dealing with it? I get caught in creating my own reality, but also seeing what's there. There's a blog post from, I think, 2015 called Focusing on Reality, and I kind of recommend that you go read that one, because I think it can address some of the things that you're asking. And part of that is that when we focus on reality, on what's happening right now, we immediately start to divorce ourselves from those past thoughts, right? We start to ask ourselves, what's actually happening right now beyond the thought? Well, I'm sitting, I'm breathing. There's light from the lamps, right? There's light from the computer, right? When we start to bring that in, it kind of starts to break down this focus on whatever the repetitive thought. And so that's one part to it. And there's a lot of other parts that I kind of go into in general about how we break down issues. And journaling can be helpful, and looking at the thought and finding out, why am I attached to it? How is it helping me? I think is a great question, because most of our beliefs are trying to help us. They're just not usually doing a particularly good job. So when we start to see that the ego, well, I've talked about how it can be so problematic, and I really mean the unconscious ego. That's all of our beliefs that got made up and we just accepted from the get-go and built on top of a foundation we don't understand. That ultimately is just trying to help. And as we become more conscious, and really we're creating a conscious ego, an ego that knows we've created it and knows we can uncreate it and knows it ultimately doesn't exist, that's just a helpful means of doing stuff like interpreting energy. And we just keep that part that we're creating more and more flexible. So we don't hold on to it. We don't confuse how we're interpreting things, including energy, to be the only way or always the correct way. So there's much more flexibility and humility that comes out of that. So I guess this will be my last question for tonight. Thanks everybody for joining. And once again, I want to remind, I'm going to answer yours, Damien. I'm just, wrapping up for everyone else. But I want to remind everyone, every 2 weeks, I do these free talks. The next one will be at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, and I'll be talking about spiritual awakening and dealing with disorientation. So last question here is from Damien. I find myself looking for signs of my fiance whom passed in 2006. I realize my reality is learning how to accept what's here and what's energy in the present moment. Absolutely. And it sounds like there's some grieving that you need to do. Right? Grieving is an important part of the process when we feel deeply connected to somebody, of letting them go. And the completion of grieving will mean that you won't look for any more signs of your fiance, that you're at peace and this person is also at peace. So I think on that note, thank you all for all these great questions and for interacting. I appreciate it. If you have other questions, feel free to email me. And once again, I'll reply as I'm intuitively guided. And I look forward to having you at the next talk. And once again, I'm over at spiritualawakeningprocess.com, and new blogs go up every Monday. Have a great night or morning wherever you may.